you think you already know Jesus. The sermons, the paintings, the films, and the stories you grew up hearing, they all shaped your image of him. But what if I told you there's a side of Jesus that has been hidden from you all your life? I thought I knew him too, until the day I opened the Qur'an. What I discovered inside changed everything I believed about Jesus. When I first picked up the Qur'an, I wasn't expecting much. I had been told that Islam barely spoke about Jesus, that he was just another name among prophets. But what I found shocked me. The Qur'an didn't just mention Jesus in passing, it honored him in ways I had never seen before. It defended his purity, his miraculous birth, his mission, and his truth with words so powerful that I couldn't stop reading. This wasn't the distant, untouchable figure I thought I knew from church paintings. This was a man deeply respected, defended, and loved. A man who spoke the same message every prophet before him had spoken, to worship the one true God. The Qur'an's description wasn't confusing or vague. It was clear, powerful, and direct. Jesus was not forgotten. He was not reduced to a side note. He was central, not as God himself, but as one of the greatest messengers God ever sent. What shook me most was the way the Qur'an stripped away centuries of debate and division about Jesus' identity. No complicated theology, no philosophical arguments, just truth. He was born miraculously, performed wonders by God's permission, and was raised up by God in honor. The Qur'an showed me a Jesus that was free from human invention and untouched by distortion, the Jesus I never knew. And that's when I realized what I had been told about Islam and Jesus was incomplete, even misleading. The Qur'an didn't erase Jesus, it preserved his dignity in a way I had never seen before. So today, I want to take you on that same journey, to share the words from the Qur'an that revealed to me the Jesus I never knew, but should have known all along. When I first opened the Qur'an and read about the birth of Jesus, I expected something vague or perhaps even dismissive. After all, I was told Islam downplays him, but the truth was the opposite. The Qur'an describes Jesus' birth with detail, reverence, and protection unlike anything I had ever heard before. The story begins with Mary, a woman chosen and honored above all women of her time. The Qur'an highlights her purity and her devotion, making her not just the mother of Jesus, but one of the most respected figures in all of Scripture. When the angel came to her with the news of a miraculous child, she was shocked and questioned how such a thing could happen when no man had touched her. The reply was profound and simple. It is easy for God. Those words struck me because they placed the miracle exactly where it belonged, in the hands of God, not in the confusion of human explanations. What amazed me even more was how the Qur'an defended Mary and Jesus against accusations. When she returned to her people carrying her baby, they accused her of the worst possible things. But God gave Jesus as a newborn the ability to speak. Imagine that moment, a child in the cradle defending not only his mother's honor, but also declaring his own identity, that he was a servant of God, a prophet, and blessed by the one who sent him. This account did more than honor Jesus. It protected him and his mother from the distortions that crept in over centuries. The Qur'an didn't leave room for scandal, confusion, or myth. Instead, it presented the story with dignity, clarity, and awe. What shocked me was how much more personal and powerful this narrative felt compared to what I had grown up hearing. It didn't diminish Jesus' miracle, it amplified it. His birth wasn't just a point of doctrine, it was a living testimony of God's power and mercy. And in that moment, I realized that Islam didn't try to erase Jesus. It restored his honor, starting with the miracle of his birth. It was the Jesus I never knew, but the Jesus the Qur'an had preserved all along. The second thing that shook me when reading the Qur'an was how clearly it described who Jesus was and who he wasn't. In the faith tradition I grew up in, Jesus was often spoken of as more than human, even divine. But the Qur'an approached him differently, with words that were both humbling and deeply respectful. Jesus was a prophet and messenger of God, chosen to deliver his truth. At first, this was difficult for me to process. I wondered, does this mean Islam rejects him? The answer was the opposite. Islam doesn't reject Jesus, it protects his identity. Instead of making him an object of worship, the Qur'an restores his mission to guide people back to worshiping the one God. What struck me most was how the Qur'an's language honored his role. It called him a messenger, a bearer of revelation, a sign for humanity. These weren't small titles. In fact, the Qur'an places Jesus among the greatest of prophets, alongside Noah, Abraham, Moses, and Muhammad. The message was clear: prophets weren't rivals competing for followers, they were links in one chain, carrying the same message of monotheism throughout history. This completely changed how I viewed his story. If Jesus was a prophet, then his miracles, his teachings, his call to righteousness, all of it wasn't about elevating himself, but about pointing people back to God. It wasn't about creating new gods to worship, but about reaffirming the timeless truth that there is only one. The more I reflected, the more it made sense. If God is perfect and eternal, he doesn't need partners, children, or equals. The prophets, including Jesus, were living reminders of that truth. The Qur'an, by calling Jesus a prophet, wasn't bringing him down, it was protecting his purity from human exaggerations. And in that moment, I realized something I had never considered before. Maybe the greatest honor you can give to Jesus is not to worship him, but to listen to him, to follow the mission he was truly sent for. Islam reminded me that prophets don't point to themselves, they point to God. And Jesus, in the Qur'an, does exactly that. One of the most powerful moments for me while reading the Qur'an was discovering how it spoke about the miracles of Jesus. Growing up, I had always been taught that his miracles proved something divine about him. But the Qur'an shifted the focus in a way I wasn't expecting. It affirmed his miracles, yet made it clear they were not from his own power, but signs from God. The Qur'an describes Jesus performing extraordinary acts. He healed the blind and the leper, he gave life to the dead, and even as a child, he fashioned a bird from clay, and by God's permission, breathed life into it. Each time, the wording struck me, by God's permission. That phrase was repeated like a reminder, showing that these wonders were not his own doing, but demonstrations of God's limitless will working through him. This made me pause. I thought about other prophets I had heard of, Moses parting the sea, Elijah calling down fire from the sky, Muhammad splitting the moon. None of these miracles made those prophets divine. They were signs, not proofs of divinity. Why should Jesus' miracles be different? The Qur'an taught me that God empowers his chosen messengers with signs suited for their people. In Jesus' case, miracles of healing made perfect sense in a society where medicine and health were highly valued. These acts spoke directly to the hearts of the people, proving that he was truly sent by God. For me, this was a moment of clarity. I realized that the real miracle wasn't the act itself, but what it pointed to. Every healed person, every life restored, every sign performed by Jesus was like an arrow, not pointing to himself, but pointing back to God. The Qur'an didn't strip away his miracles. It gave them deeper meaning. This shifted my entire perspective. Miracles weren't meant to turn prophets into gods. They were meant to remind humanity of God's nearness and power. And in Jesus' case, they did exactly that. Reading this, I felt a kind of reverence I hadn't experienced before. Not just for the miracles, but for the message behind them, that God alone is the true source of power, and his prophets are the chosen vessels to deliver it. Perhaps the most shocking moment for me when reading the Qur'an was its description of the crucifixion. I had always believed it was the central event of Jesus' life. The cross, the suffering, the sacrifice. It was the foundation of the faith I grew up with. But the Qur'an gave me a very different story, one that shook me deeply. It said plainly that Jesus was not killed, nor was he crucified, though it appeared that way to people. Instead, God raised him up. When I first read those words, I stopped. How could this be? How could something I was always taught as absolute be presented so differently in another scripture? But the more I reflected, the more sense it began to make. The Qur'an was protecting Jesus from the humiliation and injustice of being crucified, affirming that God would never abandon his beloved messenger to such a fate. People may have plotted, but God's plan was greater. This was a perspective I had never considered. The crucifixion wasn't the triumph of evil over good. It was the moment God showed that no one could overpower his will. I realized this narrative wasn't about denying suffering in the world. It was about shifting focus from human defeat to divine protection. The Qur'an highlighted that Jesus' mission didn't end in tragedy, but in honor. God saved him, preserved him, and raised him, a sign that his prophets are never forsaken. This completely changed how I thought about Jesus. Instead of seeing him as a figure broken on the cross, the Qur'an presented him as a prophet uplifted and protected by God's mercy. His story didn't end in despair. It was left open, waiting for his return. That detail made me pause again. Not only was Jesus not crucified, but he still had a role to play in the future. Suddenly, his story wasn't about a tragic ending, but about an unfinished mission, one that God himself had preserved him for. Reading this, I felt the weight of centuries of assumptions lifting. What I thought was the final word on Jesus turned out to be just the middle of the story. The Qur'an's account didn't just challenge me, it gave me hope. The final discovery that left me completely speechless was learning what the Qur'an and Islamic tradition say about the return of Jesus. I had always believed his story ended with the crucifixion and resurrection, that he had already fulfilled his role in history. But in Islam, Jesus' mission is not over. He is alive, preserved by God, and will return near the end of time to play a role that no one else can. This idea fascinated me. According to Islamic belief, Jesus will return not as a new prophet with a new message, but as a restorer of truth. He will come back to correct the lies and distortions that people attach to his name. He will make it clear that he was never divine, never the Son of God, but always a servant and messenger of the one Creator. That revelation alone will change the course of history, but it doesn't stop there. The return of Jesus is described as a moment of ultimate justice. He will confront falsehood, defeat deception, and establish peace on earth. The Qur'an and Hadith emphasize that his second coming isn't about creating a new religion, but about bringing humanity back to pure monotheism, the worship of God alone. What stunned me most was the unity this idea creates. Both Muslims and Christians are waiting for Jesus, but in Islam, his return isn't just symbolic. It's part of God's divine plan, a moment when truth will be separated from falsehood once and for all. For me, this was deeply moving. It showed me that Jesus' role in history is far greater than I had ever imagined. He wasn't just a figure of the past. He is a figure of the future, a living sign of God's promise that justice will prevail and that his messengers will never be silenced. Reading this left me with a sense of awe. The Qur'an didn't reduce Jesus to a chapter in history, it made him part of humanity's destiny. And that changed everything. After everything I read, compared, and discovered, I can honestly say this: my view of Jesus will never be the same again. I grew up believing I already knew his story, but the Qur'an opened a door to truths I had never heard before, truths that were hidden in plain sight. I discovered a Jesus who wasn't rejected by Islam, but honored, protected, and placed among the greatest of God's messengers. A Jesus whose miraculous birth was a direct sign of God's power, whose miracles were not acts of self-divinity, but reflections of God's will. A Jesus who wasn't left to suffer defeat on the cross, but was raised and preserved by the Creator himself. And above all, a Jesus whose mission isn't finished, because his return is still part of the plan for humanity's future. The Qur'an gave me a perspective I never expected. It stripped away centuries of debate and confusion, and it reminded me of the simplest, purest truth, that Jesus was always pointing us back to God. That was his mission, that was his message, and that was his legacy. When I think about the differences between Islam and Christianity, I no longer see them as contradictions meant to divide. Instead, I see them as pieces of a bigger picture. Where Christianity emphasizes love, sacrifice, and salvation, Islam emphasizes honor, protection, and truth. Together, they paint a portrait of Jesus that is richer, deeper, and more human than anything I had been told before. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the real Jesus, the one both Muslims and Christians speak of, can't be confined to one tradition, one narrative, or one limited perspective. Maybe his story was always meant to transcend borders, cultures, and doctrines, to call us back to the one God who sent him. So if you've ever wondered who Jesus really was, don't be afraid to look beyond what you've always been told. Open the Qur'an. Read the words for yourself. You might be surprised, you might be challenged, and you might just be transformed like I was. Because the truth about Jesus isn't just history. It's a living reminder of God's power, his mercy, and his promise that his messengers will always be honored, remembered, and protected. And that's a truth too powerful to ignore.